Good morning. Good morning to everybody. This is Aida Araisi, and I am the Bilateral Chambers founding CEO. And I want to wish actually everybody a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening because we have an incredible array of participants that are literally joining us from all over the world. So very pleased to welcome all of you. I do want to take a moment to also welcome our AmCham partners, the American Chambers of Commerce from Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, and Oman that have also invited their members and board members to join us. So a welcome to all of them. We look forward to collaborating with them in 2021 on a whole array of programs and, of course, other AmChams that we enjoy a good relationship with. And I also want to take a moment to thank Kalman. They are the U.S. Pavilion company. They do host the U.S. pavilions all over the world. And of course, we're supporting partners of their U.S. pavilions at ADIPEC, at the Dubai Air Show, and at Arab Health. And we look forward to more of that activity, hopefully, in a post-COVID world, which we all hope to soon get to. So I want to take a moment. We've got a lot of issues that we're going to tackle today. Multiple countries with complex issues, and we're going to try to do it in an hour. But I think that we all agree that we could literally host a webinar on each individual singular issue, and perhaps we'll do so in the coming months. But today's objective is to give you a little bit of a sense of what we may be expecting during this transition to President-elect Biden's administration. We have a very sophisticated audience online, and these are people, as I said, that are joining us from the region. They are, whether they are joining us from our U.S. embassies out there, or whether the Arab embassies or the various departments of state and energy and commerce, we have a whole array of folks. But even more notably, we've got companies, the private sector, individuals that literally have billions of dollars of investments, of assets out there. And this is that time when they are risk assessing. They want a perspective, they need to plan. And I really can't think of a more prestigious panel in the sense that can give us real insights as to this administration, the Biden administration, because our panel are career diplomats, and of course they served under the Obama and Biden administrations in the region in which we're discussing. So I know that they're going to give us a very interesting perspective. So let me give you a little snapshot of who they are. I could take the whole hour on each of them, but we are going to start with Ambassador Susan Ziadeh. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula Affairs from 2014 to 2016. Prior to that, she served as the U.S. ambassador to the state of Qatar. She was served as the NEA acting principal deputy assistant secretary. She served as deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, was the official spokesperson at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, served as the deputy chief of mission in Bahrain. She's had overseas postings in Kuwait, Oman, Jerusalem, acting deputy director of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. So she's going to give us a really the big picture assessment. Of course, then we'll hand it over to Ambassador Barbara Leaf, who was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Affairs from 2013 to 2014. And then she served as the U.S. ambassador to the UAE, one of our most important bilateral relationships between the U.S. and the Middle East. She was there from 2014 to 2018. She also served as the Arabian, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq. She directed the U.S. Provincial Reconstruction Team in Basra, Iraq, and she served as the department's first director of the Office of Iranian Affairs, and served in posts in Cairo and Tunis and Jerusalem as well. And we also have on our panel Ambassador Deborah Jones. She served in the state of Libya from 2013 to 2015, the post-Gaddafi era. And then before that, she was the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait from 2008 and 2011. She also was the principal officer at the U.S. consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. And like all the other ambassadors, had responsibilities throughout the region with many notable posts. So I think we're gonna between the three of them, we're gonna hope to cover a good part of the region, and we also hope that we're gonna address so many of the questions that were submitted. So what I would like to start with is Ambassador Ziadeh, and what I want to ask her is if she could kind of frame the situation for us now, give us a perspective of where we are and where we might be heading as we transition from President Trump to a President-elect Biden. Susan, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Ida, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be on the same panel with my colleagues, Ambassador Barbara Leaf and Ambassador Deborah Jones. I'd like to take a look at the overall posture towards the region and what we might anticipate Middle East policy to be under a Biden administration, at least with response to the Gulf. First of all, I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration right off the bat will be more concerned directly with repairing transatlantic relationships, NATO relationships, some of those relationships with longstanding allies that have been frayed. But this is not to say that our relations with countries in the Middle East will not continue. Of course, our relations with Gulf countries will continue. This is not a disengagement, because for us, our interests are always to promote stability and regional security, to defeat terrorism, and we always seek to encourage regional cooperation, and in particular with our forces in the region, in the case of, for example, naval cooperation to prevent piracy and promote a safe maritime environment. Where I think things will be different is that the relationships with GCC countries in general will not be as transactional under a Biden administration as they have been under the current Trump administration. I think there is great concern in the region about great power competition and a rising China. Mark Milley, the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recently talked about his focus on Russia and China and his concern with how that will have an impact on the U.S. going forward. But this does not mean that at least I don't believe it means that there will be a complete pivot to Asia and leaving the Middle East in the dust, so to speak. I think that our posture will continue to be there. And if you look at the number of military that we have in the whole area of responsibility, from Egypt all the way to Afghanistan, we're at about 35,000 servicemen and women in the region from all the different branches of the military. I think we will look to the GCC for more participation in regional security responsibilities, burden sharing in the broadest sense. And in this case, I don't mean just financially, but where they will have the GCC countries military deployed, taking on responsibilities. We already see this with the UAE and how they have worked with us, for example, with their special forces in Afghanistan. With regards to the GCC navies, they are already part of our combined forces, maritime forces out of NAVCENT in Bahrain, and they all patrol the waters along with our navies. So these multilateral efforts will continue, and I think this is important to note that this was how the Biden administration, I believe, will look at things going forward. I think there are several points for the Biden administration that they'll be looking at in the region. Certainly Iran and the potential for reopening talks on the nuclear file with Iran. I know my colleague Ambassador Leaf will address this issue, but I think this does harken back to the issue of the transatlantic relationships and the need to shore up alliances with the P5+1, particularly the 3 European members who were important members of that of those negotiations. So let's turn to Saudi Arabia now. This is the country you asked me to focus on. And what are our issues with Saudi Arabia going forward? The first one, and I'm just going to mention it briefly, not because it's not important, but because it hasn't been one that the current administration is focused on. And we will have yet to see how the incoming administration will look at that. And that's the issue of human rights, governance, political participation, all the values that we as Americans espouse, and American concerns for these issues in Saudi Arabia going forward. They have been raised by the Congress during the past 4 years. Certain congressional delegations have gone out there. They've looked at these issues, particularly with regards to things like the women activists who've been locked up for several years now. Issues of even American citizens and their ability to have freedom of expression in the region. There's a whole host of issues on the human rights file that I believe this incoming administration will address. But let's focus on the other two, which have been very much in plain view in terms of relations with Saudi Arabia. And the first one is the war in Yemen. For our listeners and viewers, they all know that this presumed short-term Saudi intervention in March of 2015 was at the request of the legitimate government of Yemen. It was in support of the Hadi government, and it also was in response to rockets that were being fired from northern Yemen into Saudi Arabia. This is a breach of international law, creating casualties along the border. This has been going on now for 4 years with no resolution in sight. There have been thoughts about discussions and what might be possible in terms of negotiations. But even if the Saudis halt their intervention at this stage, there's still the issue of the internal Yemeni civil war and how to convince the Houthis to come to the negotiating table and negotiate in earnest. The role of the Houthis who have taken over good parts of Yemen from 2014, their role and their role as political actors are included in the GCC initiative and the national dialogue outcomes. And these documents predate their takeover of Sana'a in September of 2014. So they understand that they have a place at the table. But how this will all unfold is yet to be seen as negotiations go forward under UN auspices. Now, recent discussions in Washington under the Trump administration about designating the Houthis as foreign terrorist organization, which would certainly undermine the UN envoy Martin Griffiths' efforts to bring about a negotiated settlement. And second, if indeed they were designated a terrorist organization, this would in essence block NGOs from distributing badly needed humanitarian assistance to a huge part of the Yemeni civilian population. So if we look at the issues of the administration, they will certainly be reassessing U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia in the context of the war, whether it's munitions, logistical support, intelligence sharing. And Tony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, has said that we will be undertaking a strategic review of the bilateral relationship. The last issue I want to talk about briefly is the Gulf Rift, and we can come back to this in the Q&A. But basically, we have the upcoming meeting of the GCC January 5th in Riyadh. And we know that there have been a movement by Secretary Pompeo and Jared Kushner to try and come up with some kind of halt to this rift, and maybe looking for a way to shore up a bit of that wall of GCC opposition to Iran. And in this case, the Saudis also are of somewhat a like mind, maybe seeking to bring down the temperature a bit. So we will see what will happen at this meeting. But for now, the things that seem to be on the table for discussion is the reopening of Saudi airspace to Qatar Airways, which would in essence deny the Iranians an estimated 100 million in fees, which is part of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And we can continue with more discussion of this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as I said, each of those issues is worthy of a webinar in and of themselves. So we'll try to regroup in a little bit once every panelist has an opportunity to weigh in. Ambassador Leith, I think that one of the most notable accomplishments of the Trump administration is what we refer to as the Abraham Accords. This rapprochement between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, and then just a few days ago with Morocco, is really a riveting, accomplishment. Of course, it doesn't really address the Palestinian issue between Israel necessarily. Can you give us a perspective on what were the driving factors behind that? And how President-elect Biden will handle and continue that particular accomplishment.
Thanks very much, Ida, and very delighted to be on this panel with my colleagues and to see virtually so many friends from the region on the guest list. So a few words up front about what I think normalization, the Abraham Accords, represents and doesn't represent for the region for the moment, and I caveat that because we're looking at we have essentially a snapshot in time. But I will say that at the outset that I kind of swim against the tide right now on opinion on this, which is that notwithstanding a widespread assertion, and above all by the U.S. and the parties involved, that these normalizations represent an earthquake in the region, I think that judgment appears premature, except of course, for the Palestinians. I might use another analogy and say we're hearing the creaking, cracking sound of ice floes. But the reason I say that the impact right now is not yet widespread is that the UAE and Bahrain, to focus on the two Gulf countries, they're small Gulf states, although obviously they have considerable influence on regional affairs, but in this space, normalization, I think it's limited for the moment. And we see that even in the unwillingness of the other four Gulf states to move on normalization, including under, frankly, tremendous pressure from Washington. The Arab states across the region and Israel are consumed by the economic and other fallout from the pandemic, and they will be so for the foreseeable future. But above all, I think it's important to note that there's been a failure by most states in the region to prepare their own publics for such a shift on such a long-standing and sensitive issue. So for the moment, the main implications of the deal are bilateral for the UAE and Israel, Bahrain and Israel for these two countries, and the U.S. And above all, I would stress for the U.S. and UAE relationship. Bahrain has done for some years what the UAE had been doing in sort of a more grandiose fashion, which is what I call normalization with a small n. But frankly, Bahrain was pushed by the U.S. into taking the decision on normalization earlier than it might have. And it felt a certain degree of countervailing pressure initially from Riyadh. But importantly on Riyadh, the decision to permit El Al flights, to essentially greenlight Bahrain to proceed, to assist behind the scenes on other things, on other normalization accounts, was really to relieve a bit of the U.S. pressure on Saudi Arabia to normalize right now. So there are unquestionably enormous benefits to be reaped by the UAE and Bahrain for taking this step. And it was a very carefully calculated step and a calculated set of risks by Abu Dhabi in particular for clear benefits. So geostrategic reasons, status reasons, the benefits of overt cooperation on defense, intelligence, security, counterterrorism, and a new set of wide-ranging cooperation, not just government to government, but importantly, private sector to private sector and government to private sector in economic terms, in agriculture, food security, health, environmental, and of course, high tech. Now, the interesting thing is the UAE is proceeding at light speed to build out the relationship. And Bahrain with considerably more care and a certain slowness, because the Bahrain has an entirely different set of internal demographics and dynamics to manage. There is unhappiness to some degree in both the Sunni and Shia communities in Bahrain, and that unhappiness is played out publicly. I would also note the UAE has been saying publicly since the announcement in August that, but more explicitly now, that momentum is organic now to normalization. In other words, there is a velocity and a dynamism to the bilateral construction of the relationship between UAE and Israel that will not be slowed down even by hiccups in terms of things Israel might do on the Palestinian account. Nor does the UAE rely on the US for this velocity. Bahrain, on the other hand, has made it clear to US and Israeli officials that it's going to continue to want the US in the mix as it builds out a relationship with Israel. For the UAE, just a moment to focus on this. I look at this, I assess this as a strategic decision, and one that came after a period of 6 to 8 years in which the leadership of the UAE took a series of steps in two directions. One, to foster a heightened and well-defined sense of Emirati nationalism, particularly in the country's youth, but importantly, alongside it, an increasingly public manifestation of this and self-confidence in doing so, of testing the waters of normalization. So you saw the UAE compete 7, 8 years ago to host the headquarters of a UN agency, IRENA, and to host an international cultural event, the World Expo, and it's called Dubai 2020, as well know. And both of those competitions in which the UAE competed quite ferociously against some world-class competition came with the explicit or implicit requirements to admit an Israeli diplomatic, official, or tourist presence. You also saw sports events in 2016 and 2017 in which Israeli athletes were publicly acknowledged, even if the flag and the national anthem weren't displayed. But you had in 2018 breakthroughs with a very highly publicized sporting event at which you had an Israeli Minister of Sports attend, and you had the UAE's invitation to Israel to participate formally in Dubai 2020 to have their own platform. So the testing I see by the UAE leadership was first and foremost with its own public and secondarily with the region. But the bonus was really to set the UAE apart from the rest of the region in US and Western eyes, and it succeeded in large part. Sudan and Morocco, just a word on that, although it's not really the focus of our discussion today, they were pushed pretty aggressively by the administration to take the steps on normalization and against very specific benefits, again, in the relationship with the US that were negotiated. So in a sense, in a curious sense, Israel was almost in a sense a bystander to this normalization push by Washington. And I will also note that 3 of the 4 deals had no reflection whatsoever in terms of the Palestinian issue. And I mention that because it's striking that whatever the shift in the downward shift in prioritization or urgency of the Palestinian cause for many Arab governments, it is still there. It is still there as a set of issues that resonate very deeply with large swaths of the publics across the region. And you see this again and again in public polling. I was looking at some the other day from the Arab Center, and I looked at some from my own think tank colleague, David Pollock, and you see shifts, but you don't see a reduction altogether of the Palestinian cause as a social cause, and nor do you see, even where there has been a downward shift for the public on the primacy of the Palestinian cause, you don't see that translating into an upward shift of support for their governments to normalize. So these are still issues that all of these governments have to grapple with. I want to just say a word now about Iran and how this figures with the incoming administration and the relationships with the Gulf. As Susan said, quite rightly, there is momentum now of a very serious kind behind a reconciliation of this very acrimonious 3.5-year-old rift between Qatar on the one side and Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt on the other side. And it is my expectation that at the January 5th summit, that there will be an announcement, at least on the opening of airspace. I think there's going to be, I understand there's going to be a period of a sort of a testing period for other elements of a sort of a testing period for good faith and confidence building measures. Why are they doing it now? For one thing, they were pushed really, really hard by the administration over the past year. They came close in January, then it fell apart. There is, I think, an appreciation among the leaderships that there's been a cost to both sides, cost in economic terms, cost in political terms, certainly a cost in terms of their publics, and a cost in the sense of unifying around common action against common threats. And obviously, Iran is one of those very significant threat issues for these governments. The Biden administration and Biden himself has been clear that he will plan to re-enter the P5+1 JCPOA, the nuclear accord of 2015, in a sense condition, not quite condition, but essentially U.S. re-entry for Iran returning to full compliance in terms of the accord itself. But he has said repeatedly that the accord falls short, that there's a need now to expand and refresh and to essentially negotiate a follow-on accord on the nuclear dimension, and a new negotiation to limit the ballistic missile arsenal of Iran, and a less defined set of negotiations to be done on Iran's destructive regional activities. And I think this is really where Gulf unity will be quite important. Now, I will say, given how deep going the bitterness and I would say ideological issues are that have divided the two sides in the Gulf family, with Kuwait and Oman, of course, not partaking in it. I think this is going to be a difficult rapprochement for them to operationalize, to make meaningful. But it will be quite important if they are to have a seat, as it were, a voice in these negotiations going forward. Again, all of this is pretty non-defined at this point by the Biden administration, not surprisingly, until the administration is seated in January, until they have been able to have full-going consultations with the Europeans, but also with Russia and China, who have not signed on yet, I will say, to the notion of either the expanded nuclear agreement or the missile negotiation or the regional discussion. So there is a lot of devils in those details. But I think it is important, this step towards a greater unity of purpose that the Gulf countries seem to be gradually approaching, and that will enable them to, if not speak with one voice, speak with a clearer voice to the administration about these threat issues. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, and of course we have a bunch of questions which we'll get back to from our audience. But let's move on to Ambassador Jones. There's a lot of news about Turkey with the sanctions that were imposed, and you of course served as the principal consul general there in Istanbul, with as well a connection now, of course, to Libya when you were ambassador. When we talk about Libya, we talk about all these countries, UAE, Egypt, Turkey, the Europeans, all with a stake, it seems, in Libya. What is our stake in Libya, and what would President-elect Biden's approach be to this ongoing, interesting conflict?
Thank you, Ida. And first of all, let me add to my colleagues and say what a delight and a privilege it is to be on the same panel with these two colleagues who are so accomplished and probably far more articulate and coherent than I'm going to be, especially dealing with the subject of Libya. Coming right out of the box, I would say something which is that, as I think we all know, the Biden administration, I'd say a couple of things. First, the Biden administration is going to be really focused on big issues. I mean, COVID, the economy, the global economy, the rise of power, great power competition, and also the rise of medium power competition in the regions, the medium power overlap. I'll talk a little bit about that, but also about our transatlantic relationships, some of which many are calling into question, and I'll exemplify that in Libya, in the case of Libya as well. But also, the environment, international trade. So insofar as those things intersect in places, you're going to see focus, more focus. And Libya is a kind of a petri dish for a lot of these things. But I also want to underscore one other thing that I think we all need to bear in mind as we kind of project on administrations, and that is the perspective from overseas. For the three of us who between us have over 100 years of service with the U.S. government, we were accustomed to working in an environment where foreign policy was bipartisan policy, largely, with probably one or two exceptions in our careers, where these were really bipartisan. Even the invasion of Iraq had Democrats in the Senate, voting for it. We're now at a period where and I say this with deep humility when I talk about Libya, because I think our smugness, we need to look again at our own governance situation here in the United States, the uncertainty about it, a lot of the question marks that have been raised about our ability to conduct a unified foreign policy. And if I were a leader in the region, in the Near East region, or anywhere in Turkey or elsewhere, I would be assessing in my mind whether this Biden administration is going to last for more than 4 years. I would be saying, well, gee, if the other side got 74% or 74 million votes and all of this churn about it right now, do I hold off or do I go forward with whatever the Biden administration is doing? And I think that that's something we all need to keep in our minds. And I think with the conclusion in my mind that the regional powers are going to do more and more of what they see in their self-interests, and that we need to calculate that, take that into consideration in our calculus, what it is that matters to them, and their willingness to kind of deflect or ignore what the U.S. had, not entirely ignore, but to customize our policies toward their ends. And I think Libya provides an extreme example of that. When we come to Libya, I think there are two issues here. One is the Libyan situation internally and what it would take to solve that situation. And I think what we all saw with the demise of Gaddafi was that we were dealing with a very both fragmented and networked situation in Libya with really different interests, whether you were in the oases area, the desert areas, the tribal areas, or the city-state areas, both in the east and the west. But I think that most people would agree in broad terms that the issues that have divided the Libyans themselves, and I'm not talking here right now about external powers, I'm talking about the Libyans themselves, have been issues of governance arrangements. Now, they hate the word federalism. Many Libyans do. We've tried to use different terms in that, whatever you want to call it. And I think that one of the terms that people have focused on is subnational governance as a broad term to say, how do you, which we're dealing with in the States, by the way, as well here, but subnational governance arrangements, how to distribute the political power amongst Libyans, and also how do you distribute the nation's enormous oil wealth, which is what has kept Libya going. And I have always insisted that oil has been the heart, lungs, and and the arteries of Libya, and the one thing that actually ironically holds it together, because of course the oil sits in deep pockets in the south, in the Fezzan area. It comes up through tribal areas and it's distributed through the city-states in the north, on the coastal rim. So that is an area that they have to focus on. The most recent negotiations, which I would have to say our former colleague Stephanie Williams, I think, has done an incredible job with great diligence and with great wisdom and knowledge of the situation, and also with great fortitude, has been to continue to try to bring together these groups, which have over the years and since I served there, kind of kept fragmenting and breaking off and growing larger, because if there was one thing that Gaddafi did instill in Libyan minds, it was that they each had to say that they were all part of this great Jamahiriya, that they all had a voice for everything, and it creates a certain, one could say it was very democratic, others could say it's quite chaotic, but in any event, everyone wants to be a part of the discussions, and I think that they have gotten to a point after the disruption of the discussions in 2019 with the assault on Tripoli by Haftar. They have actually kind of rebuilt to a point where they're now looking at constitutional processes, and with a guarantee of elections in December 2021. They're having, they've had great meetings in Tunisia. There are still problems of bringing in the political elites. There are problems of deciding who will be the council of three, how it will be elected, how it will be chosen, who qualifies, and also then the election of a separate prime minister. And as usual, everyone's jockeying for power, whether overtly or subversively, I would say in some cases. And the big problem remains too that they don't have a constitutional basis yet that is going to determine what the limitations of authorities are, how those authorities will be selected, and what their actual governance will be, what their authorities will be. So that's one huge issue that's out there. They did do, and I know we have a lot of oil people on the line here, and I know they're watching very carefully what's going to happen to the oil agreement that the U.S. helped broker to keep the oil flowing. I think that many people were surprised to see how quickly Libyan oil production shot back up to 1.3 million barrels a day. But even that arrangement is it's right now it's vulnerable to the fact that there's no real authority for it. There's no constitutional authority for it. It's designed to end at the end of December. And then we're back in the same mess where you have the East arguing about where that oil and those revenues are going. You have the problems with the central bank and the Libyan overseas bank, because traditionally, as everyone who's dealt with Libya knows, the oil went into the overseas Libyan bank. It all came to the central bank. And the central bank, and this is something that has perplexed secretaries of state and others working on Libya alike, the central bank has been very assiduous about paying militias across the board, paying all Libyans, keeping their allowances going. Now, why would the bank do that? And this was something that, some people would say, why don't they just stop the payments to the militias? Well, it's because there are militias, armed militias. And this is another big issue in Libya, that there are very powerful armed militias who serve basically as mafia in some places, in other places who work for the government nominally. The reality is, at this moment, as Stephanie Williams has pointed out, there are 10 different military locations in Libya with non-Libyan military presence there, whether it's Turkish or Russian or Italian or a mix of other things, French, whatever it is. So now let me shift from that position. And by the way, I want to underscore here that I have always thought that if you left the Libyans to negotiate by themselves, they would come up with a Libyan solution that would work for them if it were sustained and supported by the international community. And this is, if I had to fault all of us, it's that we have tiptoed around all these things because everyone has different interests. So now let's move to the drawing of Libya now and all the lines of countries that are involved in it. And it gets pretty complicated, but in its own way, again, as I say, it's a kind of a microcosm of what's happening now internationally and what's happening in the region itself. I mean, who would ever have imagined that the US would be sanctioning its NATO ally, Turkey, with the second largest military in NATO, over the purchase by Turkey of a defense missile system from the former Soviet Union, from Russia. Meanwhile, Turkey is competing with Russia in other areas against each other. So who would have imagined that Dubai 2020 would include Israeli participation and not Turkish participation as one of the largest Sunni Muslim states in the world? And this is a brave new world. Who would have guessed that Italy and France would be at opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to Libya, two NATO allies, each having different interests? I think we could all imagine that Greece and Turkey would be snarking at each other in the Eastern Mediterranean about energy flows and newly discovered energy flows underneath, with Turkey saying, I think, and some have to, from their perspective, we have the most extensive coastline in the Eastern Mediterranean. Should we be limited to tourism? Is that what everybody's opinion is? And this is how the Turks see it. The same thing, the Turks on the S-400s, they say, well, you didn't sell us PAC-3s. What were we supposed to do? From the Turks' perspective, this is a political game, not a security game. From our perspective, it's Turkey gone rogue. From the Middle Eastern perspective, for a lot of people, this is neo-Ottomanism, which I keep hearing, and I keep smiling to myself because it shows an incredible lack of understanding, I think, of the Ottoman Empire itself and how it grew. But also at the same time from countries who in a way have adopted Ottoman patterns or Ottoman ways of allowing foreigners to live and work inside them without taking on national citizenship, which was again the Ottoman way. You provide stability, you have economic growth, and then you have all these other things. Well, I'm sure I'm raising a lot of antenna out in the area right now. But so what do we have in Libya right now? We have a situation where we also have another huge issue playing out, and that is the conflict in the region and within the Muslim world between two visions of Islam, and this will impact Biden's their decision making, and I think it will stymie and frustrate them because we have a very close partner in the UAE who very much believes in a kind of a secular nation state, seeing the UAE as a secular nation state of a Muslim character, the same way the United States is a secular nation state of a Christian, Judeo-Christian character, and now increasingly, of course, Muslim and everything else, because we're a hodgepodge. As opposed to worrying about Muslim states whose legitimacy is based on their Muslim character. And this has been why the urgent need to, I think, in some minds, to transform Saudi Arabia from being a state, because I think, as Rami Khouri brilliantly pointed out, the Arab Spring, which did trigger a lot of these things, I think you go back to two issues, 1979, and if you haven't read Kim Gaddis's book, read it. I wouldn't say everyone's going to agree with everything, but it lays out this first inclination of competing Islamic revolutions, and then you go to the Arab Spring. Rami Khouri laid out very clearly, I think there were two big issues about that. There was legitimacy and there was humiliation. When you had both things, you had uprisings. And so what you have is one approach was just to say you allow certain freedoms within a structured authoritarian hereditary regime, and you construct your society in the direction you want it to go. And this works very well with small societies. And I think Barbara alluded to that. In the UAE, you can kind of guide your society when you have 1.2 million or 1.5 million or 2 million citizens. When you're a big place, or other places where there was humiliation and there was a lack of legitimacy, you had uprisings. And now that battle still goes on. Is Islam capable of conducting democratic elections? Are Muslim countries worthy or capable of having the kind of give and take in a democratic society and exchange of power that you see in the West? And I would say that's an underlying argument. But especially it's not helped when you have a nominally democratic major Sunni country of 80 million plus citizens, which has gone increasingly autocratic and being seen in some people's minds that it's a steal of democracy. And it's exactly the pattern that we were warned about in the past when people said, do not trust political Islam. It's one man, one vote, one time, and it will increasingly end up in an autocratic regime that controls and jails journalists and everything else. And I think people have seen that. So we have these two competing ideas. And meanwhile, you have the Libyans saying, well, but we want self-determination. Well, you have the UAE saying we don't want political Islamists having access to that oil wealth. We have Russia saying, well, here's an opportunity to step in. We're in the soft underbelly of NATO and of Europe, and they're going to have a presence there. You know, they see the United States, space abhors a vacuum. When the United States moves out, others move in. You have Turkey going in there and saying, well, just like the Saudis with the Houthis, you know, we were invited by the UN recognized legitimate government in Tripoli to come in and support them against these usurpers in the East. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, that is true in a sense, but then do they stay? Do they stay or do they go? You have Qatar on one side, you have Italy, for which Libya is the sine qua non. It is an existential relationship with Italy. Existential. The gas that comes from Libya fuels Italy. And then you have the French getting involved because of counterterrorism issues in the south. So you have, and they are allying with the side that has labeled the other side Islamic terrorists, which I think both of these labels are all wrong. It's about power, it's about money, it's about access to that, all those things. Let me say this, though, I think to wrap it up, where I think the Biden administration is going to find itself, not much different where we are now, unless they see a core, sincere Libyan effort to build a government that is transparent and reliable from within. If not, it's going to be focused still on energy production and counterterrorism measures, and it will be very ad hoc. Okay. Thank you.
I knew that landing on Libya as our third topic would be, in a way, would open it up to the bigger view, because it does seem like there's so much at stake. And I think that we're definitely going to have a follow-up webinar on just that topic. We've had a whole array of questions. We haven't even talked about Iraq, which of course is a very important strategic relationship. And I wonder if any of you would like to weigh in on what you believe is going on right now with Iraq with respect to our policy there. Ambassador Leaf, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, just two words. Look, I think Iraq's one of the countries that where the economic crisis coming out of the twin shocks of twin black swans, the pandemic, and then the shocks to oil demand and oil supply because of the war, the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia last spring. All of this is generating increasing sense of crisis in Iraq. Where does that take Iraq with a new administration? I think this is going to be one of the first crisis in the region that the Biden administration may face. It will be trying to lower the temperature with Iran against an eventual set of negotiations. So Iraq as such perhaps won't be a battlefield, a contest point between Iran and the US. But on the other hand, the problems that are growing and we saw with unrest in the Kurdish region over the weekend and violent repression, these issues are boiling.
Ambassador Ziadeh, I wondered if you could weigh in a little bit as well on the conflict in Syria and our policy with Lebanon in the next few minutes.
To be honest, I haven't been tracking it as closely maybe as needed, but let me say this. Obviously, we are looking for stability and unity in Lebanon. We don't want a disenfranchised Lebanon, and we want territorial integrity in Lebanon, and that's going to be important. So I think the Biden administration is going to have to continue to look, how to shore up Lebanon economically and assist, and that will be a multilateral effort along with World Bank and international financial institutions. B, to look at how to strengthen the Lebanese army and the military there as a counterbalance to Hezbollah, which really does, till this day, remain the strongest fighting force in the region. And 3, we will want to be looking at Syria and maybe working more multilaterally in terms of looking for solutions, particularly in the north. I think that it will be, there's the oil in the north, but more importantly, what will be the future of the Assad regime, and how will we accommodate our sensibility in terms of what has happened in the civil war, and how to make Syria be able to welcome back its citizens with more representation and governance. I think that you hear people like the new incoming Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, say, we should have taken a tougher stance on Syria. And when asked about the refugee problem, he says, that's not a chapter I'm proud of. So I think that unlike the current administration, which basically has just cut a deal on the north and sold out the Kurds, I think the incoming administration will look at a more holistic view and will certainly approach the humanitarian question with much greater regard.
Thank you. There's been a number of questions about Mr. Tony Blinken and his nomination, and the State Department, and whether any of you are anticipating a lot of the roles and the vacancies that the State Department has kind of suffered in the last few years are going to be addressed. How would they be addressed by Secretary Blinken?
Well, I do know that they're really reaching out to very experienced officers and people who've served before, who were either compelled to leave or who felt compelled to leave. And excuse my Jack Russell in the background now, but I think that I hope that we don't see the plethora of special envoys that we saw in the Obama administration as well as the Trump administration. This kind of tendency to pull in people who are kind of one shot. Because I do agree, though, with Susan, and the appointment of John Kerry makes sense in some ways on the environment, because that is an overarching thing. But all the issues that we've discussed now are going to require multinational, multilateral support. I mean, Turkey has taken in more refugees than any other country in the world, and had 4 million plus or something in Turkey from Syria and from these other things. If you don't have a Turkish part of your solution, you won't have a solution, whether it's with the Kurds or with Syria or with Libya or anything else. So we are going to have to be multinational, multilateral, and look for a more sophisticated kind of interconnectivity, and ask, as Ambassador Leaf mentioned earlier too, seeking for, and both of the ambassadors have mentioned, is requiring more of our partners as well in terms of their engagement, hopefully not militarily, but when it needs peacekeeping arrangements or some kind of security arrangements, definitely.
Thank you. We're literally 2 minutes from the conclusion of this webinar. I think we haven't nearly covered everything. I want to give each of you an opportunity for some, closing thoughts. Ambassador Leaf, I'll start with you.
Well, I'll just say that the issues that will confront the Biden administration are enormous on the domestic front, and they will suck up so much of the government's bandwidth. In looking to the Middle East, however, I do believe, notwithstanding the very narrow sort of goals that the Biden administration is intending to tackle, the region has a way of sucking in every president and sucking in a lot of the senior level energy, whether it's civilian or military. I do think a more structured multilateral approach to these conflict zones will be second nature to the administration. And I do hope that there will be less of a pendulum swing in terms of relations with Israel, Gulf, and the Gulf countries, and a settled middle distance where we can have our differences, but we can ask our partners to really lean in to address with us these compelling security questions across the region.
Ambassador Jones.
I would completely second what Barbara has said, and Ambassador Leaf has said, and I don't have much to add to that. I do want to put in a small pitch. Aida and I told you I was going to do this. I'm to all of you out there, we appreciate your support. I'm currently the chair. I'm the newly named chair of Emirates. And as you know, I think I would say that our greatest legacy in the region as Americans and as the United States has been the legacy of education and support for underserved populations there, particularly with the Palestinians and others, but not only the Palestinians in Lebanon as well and elsewhere. And we have last year, I mean, we've served over 150,000 students in terms of coming in scholarships to study, to have exchanges. I would really urge you to go online and look at Emirates and see if you can find it in your corporate hearts to work with us or to support these students. And because I think that in the end, educating people in the region to resolve their own issues in ways that suit their needs and their purposes is the best solution to all of this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And Ambassador Ziadeh, we started with you and we'll end with you.
Well, with the last name that begins with Z, I'm sort of used to it. I want to also second what my colleagues have said about the region and how things are looking. The one thing I would point to that I think this administration will do, and Ambassador Jones touched on that, they will rely on diplomatic initiatives to try and move the ball down the court. I think they will look to talent, experience, and they will institute institutional and comprehensive approaches to problem solving that not only draws on our multilateral talent across the region and across the world, but most importantly, will really approach problem solving with a whole of government approach, which draws on the talent and experience of people who have worked decades on issues. And I think that's going to be an important distinction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can tell you that the consensus from the comments from our registrants is that they want more time and more insights and wisdom from all of you. So I'll have to lean on you for, I hope, another opportunity to continue this dialogue, and we'll try to structure it with more specific subjects. But I want to thank you each so very much. I want to wish you and all the registrants a continued safe holiday season as we close out 2020 and hope to have a better 2021. Again, I thank all of you and hope to reconvene in the new year. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.